After studying this module, you shall be able to know why there is a movement along the demand curve, recognize the slope of aggregate demand curve, know the factors that affect the slope of aggregate demand curve, identify aggregate demand curve in classical case and in liquidity trap case, understand the factors affecting the position of aggregate demand curve.
In this module, we are going to commence with factors affecting slope and position of aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand curve represents the relationship between aggregate output in the economy and the price level. There is an inverse relationship between aggregate demand and price level. In this module, we will study the factors that lead to the movement along the same aggregate demand curve and the factors that lead to the shift in the aggregate demand curve. In this process, we will study the factors that affect the slope of aggregate demand curve and the factors that lead to a shift in aggregate demand curve. Movement along the same aggregate demand curve. Graphically, aggregate demand curve is a downward sloping curve showing an inverse relationship between aggregate output or income and price level in the economy. Movement along the same aggregate demand curve happens due to the change in the price level in the economy. When the price level increases, there is a fall in the real balances, that is M by P, for a given amount of money stock in the economy, reducing the demand for bonds in the assets market, which in turn increases the interest rates to make the assets market come back in equilibrium. However, an increase in interest rates reduces the investment demand, which decreases the aggregate demand in the economy. In the given figure, when price level rises from P0 to P1, LM curve shifts inwards from LM0 to LM1. Interest rates increases from I0 to I1. Output falls from Y0 to Y1. Thus, when price level increases from P0 to P1, aggregate demand decreases from Y0 to Y1. There is a movement along the same aggregate demand curve. There is no shift or tilt in the aggregate demand curve. Next, we will discuss the slope of aggregate demand curve. Mathematically, the equation of aggregate demand curve is given as follows. Y is equals to gamma into A bar plus beta into M bar pi P, where beta is equals to alpha into B divided by H plus alpha K into B dash, and beta is greater than 0. The slope of aggregate demand curve is given by beta, defined previously. Note that in the previous equation, output and price level are inversely related and beta is positive. Therefore, aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The slope of aggregate demand curve reflects the degree of responsiveness of aggregate income and spending to the changes in the price level in the economy. Larger the slope, flatter will be the aggregate demand curve, or smaller the slope, steeper will be the aggregate demand curve. Figure shows two aggregate demand curves where the slope of AD2 is greater than the slope of AD1. The slope of AD curve is given as follows. Slope of AD curve is equals to beta is equals to change in y divided by change in m by p, which is equals to alpha into b divided by h plus alpha k into b. Graphically, the aggregate demand curve is tilting from its position. This is happening because the amount by which aggregate output changes in response to the change in price level changes. In other words, for a given change in the price level, if the slope of aggregate demand is high or beta is more, it will lead to larger changes in aggregate demand and output. On the other hand, for a given change in the price level, if the slope of aggregate demand is small or beta is less, it will lead to smaller changes in aggregate demand and output. Given figure explains previous mechanism. AD0 is the original aggregate demand curve and AD1 is the new aggregate demand curve with larger slope. Thus, AD1 is flatter than AD0. Now, a change in the price level from P0 to P1 produces a change in the aggregate demand by an amount of y naught dash minus y naught along AD naught curve, while the same change in the price level produces a change in the aggregate demand by an amount of y1 minus y naught along the AD1 curve. Thus, the change in the output along AD1 is greater than the change in the output along AD0 curve. Thus, for a given change in the price level, output changes by a large amount on the flatter aggregate demand than along the steeper aggregate demand curve. Moving on to the factors affecting the slope of aggregate demand curve. Factors that can make aggregate demand curve flatter or steeper are the factors that affect the slope coefficient beta of the aggregate demand curve. The factors that affect the slope of aggregate demand curve are the factors that appear in its equation. These are interest responsive of money demand, that is H, income responsiveness of money demand, that is K, interest responsiveness of investment demand, that is B, and the multiplier, which is given by alpha. First, we have interest responsiveness of money demand, which is H. For a given change in real balances M bar by P, when interest responsiveness of money demand, that is H, increases, there will be a smaller change in the output, that is Y, making the aggregate demand curve steeper. Mathematically, H appears in the denominator of the slope of aggregate demand curve. Thus, when H increases, slope beta decreases, making aggregate demand curve steeper. Economically, this is happening through the change in the equilibrium in the asset market. When H increases for a given change in the real balances M bar by P to maintain equilibrium in the asset market, there will be smaller changes in I, leading to smaller changes in investment demand and hence smaller changes in output and income. This leads to steeper aggregate demand curve. To visualize it graphically, consider the figure. The original LM curve is LM naught and the original aggregate demand curve is AD naught. When the price level increases from P naught to P1, LM curve shifts upward from LM naught to LM1, leading to a reduction in interest rates and hence a reduction in the investment demand. This reduces the output and hence aggregate demand from Y0 to Y1. However, if in this process interest responsiveness of money demand, which is H, increases rather than LM curve going all the way to LM1, it ends up moving upwards only to LM1 dash. Interest rates do not increase up to I1 but only up to I1 dash. Hence, output and spending decreases to Y1 dash rather than Y1. Since the change in the price level is same from P0 to P1, in the lower panel of the figure, one can see the tilting of the aggregate demand curve from AD0 to AD1, making it steeper. Aggregate output decreases by a smaller amount as Y0 minus Y1 is greater than Y0 minus Y1 dash. Thus, when H increases, slope of aggregate demand curve decreases and it becomes steeper. The income responsiveness of money demand, that is K. For a given change in the real balances, when income responsiveness of money demand increases, there will be a smaller change in the output, making the aggregate demand curve steeper. Mathematically, K appears in the denominator of the slope of aggregate demand curve. Thus, when K increases, slope decreases, making aggregate demand curve steeper. Economically, this is happening through the change in the equilibrium in the asset market. When price level decreases, it increases the real balances, which reduces the interest rates, increase the investment demand, and hence output and spending increases, leading to a rise in the aggregate demand. However, if K increases in this process, then to maintain equilibrium in the assets market, interest rates reduces by a smaller amount, leading to a smaller change in the investment demand and smaller changes in output and spending. Thus, aggregate demand increases by a smaller amount, leading to steeper aggregate demand curve. To visualize it graphically, refer to the given figure. A rise in K increases the slope of LM curve, making it flatter. Thus, When price level falls from P0 to P1, LM curve has to shift from LM0 to LM1. But instead, due to the increase in K, LM curve tilts to LM dash. Thus, interest rate decreases only up to I dash instead of I1. Hence, aggregate output and spending increase to Y dash instead of Y1. Since the change in the price level is same from P0 to P1, in the lower panel of the figure, one can see that the tilting of the aggregate demand curve from AD0 to AD1, making it steeper. Aggregate output increases by a smaller amount as Y0 minus Y1 is greater than Y0 minus Y dash. Thus, when K increases, slope of aggregate demand curve decreases and it becomes steeper. Interest responsiveness of investment demand, which is given by B. For a given change in real balances, when interest responsiveness of investment demand increases, there is a large change in output, making aggregate demand curve flatter. Mathematically, interest responsiveness of investment demand appears both in the numerator as well as in the denominator of the slope of aggregate demand curve beta. However, in the denominator, B is multiplied by the proportion of income responsiveness of money demand or K, where 0 is less than K is less than 1. This implies that the effect of B in the numerator is greater than the effect of B in the denominator. Thus, the slope of aggregate demand curve will increase with the increase in B, making it flatter. Economically, this is happening through the change in equilibrium in the goods market. When price level decreases, it increases the real balances, which reduces the interest rates, increases the investment demand, and hence output and spending increases, leading to a rise in aggregate demand. When B increases in this process for a given change in interest rates I due to a given change in the real balances, to maintain equilibrium in the goods market, there will be a larger changes in the investment demand, leading to larger changes in output and hence flatter aggregate demand curve. Basically, for small reduction in interest rates, investment demand increases by a huge amount, increasing aggregate output and demand. To visualize it graphically, consider the given figure. When price decreases, real balances increases, leading to a shift in LM curve from LM0 to LM1. This reduces the interest rates from I0 to I1. However, if B increases, IS curve changes its position. With the increase in B, the slope of IS curve decreases, making it steeper. In figure, IS curve tilts from IS0 to IS1 due to the increase in B. As a result, the new equilibrium in the IS-LM framework occurs at point E dash where LM1 intersects IS1 curve. Thus, at this new equilibrium point E dash, interest rates have reduced by a small amount, but investment demand has increased by a huge amount, leading to a larger increase in output from Y0 to Y dash. In the lower panel of the figure, we see that aggregate demand curve becomes flatter from AD0 to AD1. For a given decrease in price level from P0 to P1, aggregate demand increases by Y dash minus Y0, which is greater than Y1 minus Y0. Thus, with an increase in interest responsiveness of investment demand B, slope of AD curve increases, making it flatter. Next, we will discuss the effect of multiplier alpha on the aggregate demand curve. For a given change in the real balances, when the multiplier increases, there will be a larger change in the output, making the aggregate demand curve flatter. Mathematically, multiplier alpha appears both in the numerator as well as in the denominator of the slope of aggregate demand curve beta. However, in the denominator, alpha is multiplied by the proportion of income responsiveness of money demand or K, where 0 is less than K is less than 1. This implies that the effect of alpha in the numerator is greater than the effect of alpha in the denominator. Thus, the slope of aggregate demand curve will increase with the increase in alpha, making it flatter. Economically, this is happening through the change in the equilibrium in the goods market. Recall the following equation of the multiplier alpha, where alpha is equals to 1 upon 1 minus C, where C is the marginal propensity to consume, that is MPC. Thus, for a given change in income, Y, when MPC increases, there are larger changes in the consumption demand. Also note that the multiplier alpha is directly related to MPC. When MPC increases, alpha also increases. This implies that in the goods market, when alpha increases for a given change in autonomous demand, output increases by a larger amount. When price level decreases, it increases the real balances, which reduces the interest rates, increases the investment demand, and hence output and spending increases, leading to a rise in aggregate demand. When alpha increases in this process, for a given change in income, due to a given change in the real balances, consumption demand increases. This provides an additional boost to the income and spending in the economy, leading to larger changes in output and hence flatter aggregate demand curve. To visualize it graphically, consider the given figure. The same figure is used to study the effect of an increase in alpha on the slope of aggregate demand curve. When price decreases, real balances increases, leading to a shift in LM curve from LM0 to LM1. This reduces the interest rates from I0 to I1 and an increase in output from Y0 to Y1. However, if alpha increases, IS curve changes its position. With the increase in alpha, the slope of IS curve decreases, making it steeper. In figure, IS curve tilts from IS0 to IS1 due to the increase in alpha. As a result, the new equilibrium in the IS-LM framework occurs at point E dash, where LM1 intersects IS1 curve. Thus, at this new equilibrium point E dash, consumption demand has increased by a huge amount, leading to a larger increase in output from Y0 to Y dash. In the lower panel of the figure, we see that the aggregate demand curve becomes flatter from AD0 to AD1. For a given decrease in the price level from P0 to P1, aggregate demand increases by Y dash minus Y0, which is greater than Y1 minus Y0. Thus, with an increase in the multiplier alpha, the slope of aggregate demand curve increases, making it flatter. Note that when B increases, aggregate demand curve becomes flatter due to a larger changes in the investment demand. However, when alpha increases, aggregate demand curve becomes flatter due to the larger changes in consumption demand. Extreme classical versus liquidity trap cases. Aggregate demand curve is downward sloping with the slope given by beta. In classical case, money demand is not responsive to the interest rates, or H is zero, making LM curve vertical. In such a scenario, small changes in real balances, that is in M bar by P, leads to a large changes in income, making aggregate demand curve flat. On the other hand, in liquidity trap case, money demand is highly responsive to interest rates or H approaches to infinity, making LM curve horizontal. In such a scenario, equilibrium income or spending becomes unresponsive to the changes in the price level, making aggregate demand curve vertical. Given figure plots three aggregate demand curves. AD0 is the regular downward sloping aggregate demand curve. AD1 is the aggregate demand curve pertaining to the classical case, while the vertical AD2 is the aggregate demand curve showing the liquidity trap. When price level changes from P0 to P1, there is no change in the output in the liquidity trap case, that is AD2, where Y0 is equals to Y2. However, in the classical case, output changes by a huge amount from Y0 to Y1 along AD1 curve in comparison to the regular change in the output from Y0 to Y0 dash along AD0 curve. Factors that affect the position of AD curve leads to a shift in the curve either rightwards or leftwards. Along with the factors that affect the slope of aggregate demand curve, its position is affected by the changes in the fiscal and monetary policy of the economy. Let us discuss the fiscal policy changes. An increase in government expenditure shifts the IS curve rightwards. This increases the interest rates and the level of income and spending in the economy at a given price level. As a result, aggregate demand curve shifts rightwards. Changes in the fiscal policy shift the aggregate demand curve. Mathematically, aggregate demand curve shifts by an amount of gamma is equals to change in y divided by change in a bar, where a bar is equals to c bar plus I bar plus g bar, and change in a bar is equals to change in g bar due to the fiscal policy changes. Thus, the amount of shift in aggregate demand curve depends on gamma and change in a bar. Similarly, aggregate demand curve will shift with the change in autonomous consumption C bar and autonomous investment I bar. Now, we will discuss the monetary policy changes. When nominal money balances increases by the central bank, real money stock increases at a given price level, leading to a rightward shift in the LM curve. This reduces the interest rates I and stimulates the investment demand and hence an increase in the aggregate demand in the economy. However, what matters for the aggregate demand are the real balances and not the nominal balances. Thus, when money stock increases without any change in the price level, there is an equiproportionate increase in aggregate demand. Consider the given figure. When money stock increases from M0 to M1, real balances changes from M0 by P to M1 by P. Aggregate demand shifts proportionately from AD0 to AD1. Note that when money stock increases, economy moves to the equilibrium point of E1. But at E1, real balances are higher than at E0. Thus, at E2, price levels are higher at P1 in exactly the same proportion as the nominal money stock. Therefore, real balances at point E2 on AD1 is same as real balances at point E0 on AD0, giving a proportional shift in AD curve.
Let us now summarize what we have learnt in this module. Aggregate demand curve represents the inverse relationship between aggregate output and spending in the economy and the price level. Movement along the same aggregate demand curve happens due to the change in the price level. Slope of aggregate demand curve is given by the coefficient beta, where beta is equals to alpha into B into H plus alpha into K into B, where beta is greater than 0. Factors that affect the slope of aggregate demand curve are interest responsive of money demand, that is H, income responsiveness of money demand, that is K, interest responsiveness of investment demand, which is B, and the multiplier itself, which is being given by alpha. An increase in the interest responsiveness of money demand, that is H, decreases the slope of aggregate demand curve and make it a steeper curve. An increase in income responsiveness of money demand, that is K, decreases the slope of aggregate demand curve, making it steeper. An increase in the interest responsiveness of investment demand, that is B, increases the slope of aggregate demand curve, making it flatter. An increase in the multiplier, that is alpha, increases the slope of aggregate demand curve, making it flatter. Aggregate demand curve in the liquidity trap case is vertical, where aggregate output is not responsive to the changes in the price level. Aggregate demand curve in extreme classical case is flatter, where small changes in the price level produces huge changes in the aggregate output. Aggregate demand curve shifts rightward due to the fiscal expansion. Aggregate demand curve shifts rightward proportionately to an increase in the nominal money stock in the economy.